Hello everyone, my name is Kitty. I just quickly wanted to make a quick intro since I'm very excited to get started on this project. Recently a wall painting was put up by Eric Schwartz. His Instagram handle is Comic Blues and it is so cute, and I just want to take some fun pictures in front of it in a cute kind of inspired outfit. So I decided I'm just going to look through my stash, see what I have on hand, and see what I can put together. Right now I'm thinking I might do something a bit 90s glam, but we will see. I'm going to kind of look through what I do have on hand and then use that as sort of inspiration and a jumping off point. So let's get going. So I quickly want to talk about my thought process for making the pattern for this slip dress. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it since I am considering making a second video in which I'll go into more detail for the construction of this slip dress. But I did kind of want to share the process and sort of some decisions I made. So I did start by just draping directly on my mannequin, and this was sort of my first attempt at draping. As you can see, it's sort of two rounded triangles, which when put together would form sort of a bralette shaped top. And I wasn't too pleased with the way that was looking since I wanted something that was a little bit more 90s red carpet glam. So I gave it a second attempt and I tried extending this side piece out a little bit more. And I wasn't too sure if I wanted it to be a dart or have a full seam along the bust. But I did love this V shape that was being created from the center of the bodice and then tapering down to the side. So what I did was a new approach. I saran wrapped my body from sort of the under bust to above, and then I used packing tape to create the bust shape. And then with a pen, I marked on the packing tape on my body the shape of the bodice I wanted to create. I then cut off the packing tape from my body and then cut out the shape that I had marked. And then from the under point of my bust up to the apex, I cut the pattern open, sort of creating the dart shape so that when you spread it out, you can make it flat and trace it into a pattern shape. And I was pretty pleased with this pattern shape. It was definitely the direction I wanted to go, but I did want to make a few more tweaks. So I traced it out and started kind of tinkering with it, seeing how I could change the design. And I ended up rounding out the armpit right here, sort of the side piece, and I tried extending the side a little bit more and dropping it even lower down. I really wanted to emphasize that V shape I was making. The only thing though was that this piece was a little bit more fitted to the bust, and I decided I wanted something that'd be a little bit more loose and drapey. So I ended up taking this pattern and expanding it, making it a little bit larger. And eventually I ended up with this pattern, which you can see the dart pinned in right here. And after pinning in the dart, I traced the bottom of the bodice onto a skirt top edge, creating the skirt top edge. And that's going to be sort of the front of the slip dress. And then just very simply on the back, just kind of keeping with that scooped back shape, I just decided to make a back piece. And I am pretty pleased with the way the pattern is coming along. I think I'm going to make a mock-up, kind of fine-tune any last little sticky bits, and then move on to cutting out the nice fabric. And this is my mock-up for the slip dress. I'm pretty happy with how everything is fitting. I ended up taking in the side seams just the tiniest bit, and I transformed the bust dart into a full seam, which you can see here. Now I'm ready to take my pattern pieces and cut them out on my fabric. For this dress, I will be using 2 meters of this coral satin that I had on hand. As you can see, I went ahead and lined my pattern pieces along the bias because I want to take advantage of that beautiful draping effect you can create when cutting pieces out on the bias. Now this method can be a little bit tricky and a little bit more fabric consuming, but I love the effect it creates. I ended up extending the front and back of my skirt pieces by a few inches on the bottom. And then the next thing I did was cut out the bodice pieces. I cut out 4 bodice pieces, 2 for the outside layer and 2 for the lining. And then I cut out 3 strips of fabric. 1 will be used to complete the top edge of the back of my skirt and 2 will be for straps. The first thing I did was go around all of the edges of my bodice and skirt pieces and give them a stay stitch. This is just to prevent any extra fraying or stretching and just prepare these pieces for construction. After adding the stay stitch, I went to my 4 bodice pieces and carefully marked the dart placement, which I think you can faintly see here. Next, I used pins and pinned my dart in place. And instead of tapering the dart off, I just continued it all the way to the top of the bodice to create a sort of dart/faux seam. I just repeated this 3 more times, that way all 4 pieces of my bodice had a dart. And then I just folded over that extra fabric from the dart and straight stitched it in place so that it wouldn't flap around. Next, I pinned my bodice pieces to the curve of the front of my skirt, being very careful to pin and work them along that front point and curve. And then I just stitched them in place with a very generous seam allowance, that way none of my stay stitches would show. Now I think this would be an amazing project for an overlock machine, but I don't have one, so I just used a straight stitch and then finished up my edges with a nice zigzag stitch. Now I'm going to momentarily set my front piece aside and quickly just bind that top back edge of my skirt with a matching strip of fabric. It's just a strip that I cut from my leftover fabric, that way everything matches and blends together. So I just pin the pretty side of my strip of fabric to the wrong side of the back of my dress, and I straight stitch along that top edge. And then what I do is I just fold that piece of fabric over 2 times, pin it in place, and top stitch it down in place. This is going to create a nice finished edge for the back of your dress. Now returning to the front of my dress, I'm going to take the 2 other bodice pieces I have prepared. These will be the lining, and I match them up pretty sides touching to the bodice pieces that have already been attached to my skirt. I pin them together, careful to match the seams underneath. And I almost forgot, but I go ahead and prepare the straps for my dress. That way I can sandwich them between the outside and lining layers of my bodice. I start by sewing the sides of the strip together, finish the edges with a zigzag stitch. I use a safety pin to turn them inside out and then press them nice and flat with the iron. And now I can just insert it between the 2 layers of my bodice at that very top point of the bodice piece, kind of right where that dart or seam is. Now that I've inserted the straps between the lining and the outside of my bodice pieces, I can go ahead and straight stitch the bodice pieces together and finish off the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Next, I fold the bodice piece inside out, and I'm very careful to make sure the tops of the triangles are nice and pointy. And then I can fold under any seam allowance on the lining of my bodice pieces and pin them in place. As I work, I make sure to smooth everything out and make sure everything sits nicely. And then I'm going to hand stitch the lining to the seam allowance of the dress. That way, none of the hand stitching will show through to the front of the dress. So again, as I hand sew that folded over bottom edge of the lining, I'm just trying to be very careful and hand stitch it to that little bit of seam allowance from where the front of the skirt meets the front of the bodice to the showing side of my dress. This is a great way to hide any of the raw seams, and here you can see what it looks like on the inside and the outside. Now all that's left to do is match the front of the dress to the back piece of the dress all along the side seams. You can pin these edges together, and I like to start working from the top down because you can always trim and hem the bottom of your dress later. Then I sew the front and back of my dress together along those side edges using a straight stitch, and then I go back and finish those raw edges with a tight zigzag stitch. But of course here you may prefer to do a French seam. Next, I try on my dress and figure out how long I want my straps, and I use a pin to mark the desired length. I then trim the straps to my desired length and then fold the raw edges inward. Next, I pin the straps in place on the back of my dress and I just top stitch them down. And I'm very careful to match the top stitching of my straps with the top stitching on that bound edge on the back of my dress. That way it kind of hides nicely together. Now all that's left to do is to trim the bottom of your dress to your desired length and give it a nice clean rolled hem. Now before hemming the bottom of your dress, I recommend putting it on a hanger or a dress form and letting it hang at least 24 hours. Because this dress was cut on the bias, you want to give it a little time for the fabric to potentially stretch if it needs to, and then trim it if necessary. So yeah, before you hem the bottom of your dress, I definitely recommend letting it hang for a little bit and stretch if it needs to, then trimming, then hemming. Now that I've completed the slip dress, I'm going to make a fun matching stole. For the body of the stole, I'm going to be using 1.5 meters of black satin. I'll also be using some scraps of blue, white, and black satin for the eyeball designs. And I'll be using about 1/2 meter of this Bonda web, which is a fusible adhesive with transfer paper on the back. I really recommend it for applique. It makes it so easy. So I start by cutting my 2 meters of black satin into 4 pieces. That way I can make 2 long rectangles. One will be for the front and one will be for the back of the stole. I then match my black rectangles into pairs, and on the short side sew them together with a straight stitch, finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch, fold the seam allowance over and top stitch it down so it doesn't wiggle or shift. And now my 4 rectangles have been turned into 2 really long rectangles. As you can see, I made 1 rectangle on which I'm going to be placing the eyeball designs, and the other one will be the lining or inside of the stole. So now, using some scrap paper, I cut out shapes to help me decide on the eyeball size and placement that I want. After cutting out all of the eyeball shapes and figuring out about how many I want and what size, I can now use them as stencils and transfer them over to my Bonda web. So I just lie down the paper eyeball stencils on the paper side of my fusible adhesive and use a pencil and just trace the shape. I want to put them close together, but with just a tiny bit of space in between. And once I'm settled on my eyeball shapes, I cut out circles for pupils and irises, and I trace those on to the paper side of my bonded web as well, making sure that I have enough pupils and irises for each eyeball. And finally, I just cut everything out, making sure to lump the white eyeballs together, the irises together, and the pupils together, since I will be ironing them onto specific satin. And here is all of my bonded web ready to be squeezed onto my scraps of blue, white, and black satin. So leaving the paper side on the fusible adhesive, I put the adhesive side on the wrong side of my satin and then use the iron to carefully press it and melt it into the wrong side of the satin. I do this on my blue, black, and white satin, and once finished, I can cut the shapes out. And here are all of my pieces cut out and ready to be assembled. So I start by figuring out where exactly I want the white portion of the eye to be on my stole. I place them on my stole and then just use one pin to secure them in place. Once everything is positioned, I can take it to the ironing board, and there I will remove the pin, carefully take off the paper backing, and place the adhesive side on the pretty side or the right side of my black satin and press that white satin in place, adhering it to the black satin. And to finish the edges of the applique, I set my machine to a zigzag stitch, put it on a short length, about a 1, and a 4.5 or 5 on width. Now, with that very tight zigzag stitch, I can go around the edges of my applique shape and cover them. This will cover any raw edges and prevent any fraying, but it'll also give it a nice decorative stitched finish. Once my white shapes are attached, I go back to the ironing board and iron on my blue shapes. Again, I peel off the paper backing and attach the adhesive side, lying it on top of the right side of my white satin. And I use my iron to press it very thoroughly and let that adhesive melt so that it is completely attached, the blue satin to the white satin. And then I go around the edges of my blue circle with that tight zigzag stitch one more time to finish the edges. Now, because I don't have a matching blue thread, I go ahead and opt for white so that it'll have a nice seamless look. After adding my blue iris, I'm ready to add the black pupil to the center of my eye. So I take my stole back to the ironing board and I peel off the paper backing, repeat all the steps, and attach the black pupil in the center of my blue iris. And this time you can see I finished the edges with a black zigzag stitch. Now you can line up the back of your stole with the front, pretty sides facing one another, and you can sew all of the edges together with a straight stitch. And make sure to leave a little gap so that you can turn it inside out. After sewing the edges together, you can clip the corners and then turn it inside out. and give it a press if you like. The final thing I like to do is go around all the edges and top stitch the top to the bottom. This kind of gives it a nice finished looking edge and prevents the top and bottom of the stole from shifting too much when wearing it. You can also go over the little gap you left open to turn it inside out and top stitch it shut as well. And finally, the dress and stole are finished. Let's see how they look together. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.